Welcome to Real Paranormal Activity, the network. Entertainment you'll enjoy.
You are listening to an RPA production, where people gather. LaFosse Corporation, LLC.
The world is full of mysteries. It's full of strangeness. And it exists with oddities. That's what we do on this show. We examine the strangeness, the mysterious, the oddities. This is Terry's Mysterious Moments, and I am your presenter, Terry from Texas. This is Season 8. Welcome if it's your first time. Welcome back if you've been here before. Go with us on this trip while we look at cryptids like Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster, and maybe even Thunderbirds. Be with us while we examine stories of legends such as werewolves, vampires, witches, ghosts, and hauntings. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the show. Hello everybody, this is Terry from Texas with another episode of Terry's Mysterious Moments. Now, this show, having the word mysterious in its name, doesn't always mean frightening. It doesn't always mean scary. Sometimes it can mean you scratch your head and go, huh? After you hear the story. Sometimes that means it's funny. That's what I want to talk about today. Some errors that militaries have made that are actually kind of funny if you think about them. Starting with this one, in what might be one of the strangest incidents to ever occur in aviation history, a Soviet MiG-23 fighter flew unmanned all the way from Poland to Belgium. Once it ran out of fuel, the plane crashed into a home and killed a teenage occupant, which is sad, but still. The fiasco began on July 4th of 1989 when the pilot, a Colonel Skurigan, saw the afterburner appear to fail during takeoff. As the plane steadily descended, Skurigan believed that the engine had completely shut down, so he ejected safely. But to his surprise, the plane didn't crash. Instead, it continued flying west on autopilot. U.S. fighter jets escorted the pilotless MiG during its flight over West Germany, eventually breaking off as it flew over the border. The French also put their fighters on alert in case the rogue jet reached their airspace. But as mentioned before, however, the MiG wound up crashing in Belgium instead. In the aftermath, the Belgian government criticized their Soviet counterparts for their slow response to the situation and failure to inform them whether the jet possessed nuclear or biological weapons. There's a similar story from World War II where a B-17 was on its way back from a bombing raid. I'm thinking it was over Germany, and the plane came under attack or developed problems, and the crew bailed out of the plane. And they didn't think anything about it. They just figured the plane would crash eventually, which it did. Sort of. The plane came in for a perfect landing at a Belgium airfield. What is it about Belgium and spooky planes? But anyway, the B-17 came in for a landing and landed perfectly and sat there surrounded by security forces, its engines running, no response from them on the radio. So they finally, somebody bravely went out to the airplane, climbed on board, and there was absolutely nobody there. Somehow the plane came in. I don't know if it had autopilot or not, but somehow the plane came in and made a perfect landing. They found the crew had bailed out earlier when they found the crew, and the crew told the story of what happened. Some of those things that just really, like I said, make you scratch your head and go, huh? During World War II, the Japanese built a pair of battleships. One was the Yamato, the other was the Musashi. They were twins, they were huge, they were overgunned, they were going to kill everything in the Pacific. But go back a ways. The American forces finally sank the battleship Musashi, but before that happened, they obviously had to build the ship and they had to set the ship asail. The Musashi boasted a displacement of over 65,000 metric tons, which is 72,000 actual tons, when fully armed, and possessed 46 centimeter or 18.1 inch guns with a range of nearly 23 miles. In addition, the giant battleship bristled with myriad smaller guns, including as many as 150 anti-aircraft batteries. It was an enormous ship, and because of its size and weight, the Musashi unintentionally flooded the city of Nagasaki when it was launched in November of 1940. The process of lowering the huge ship into the water caused a meter-high tsunami that flooded the surrounding residential areas and capsized nearby fishing boats. But owing to the secretive nature of the launch, the Japanese military kept the flooded residents from leaving their homes. And fortunately for them, no further mishaps plagued the rest of the ship's construction, which was finally finished in August of 1942. You know, you see videos sometimes of these ships being released, and in my mind, you put a ship in the water stern first. You let it slide down the ramp and it goes into the water. But I've seen others where they put them in broadside, which looks to me to be a very dangerous way of doing it, but they do it. And that's what happened with the Musashi. We know that the British military has its share of military blunders throughout history. And in an effort to regain lost glory and avenge the rude treatment their diplomats suffered in Spain, the British sent a force of between 10,000 and 15,000 men on more than 80 ships to invade the Spanish city of Cadiz in 1625. Although terrifying on paper, and it sounds terrifying, the amount of forces used, the force consisted mostly of undisciplined men who had been pressed into service. These were guys that didn't want to be in the military, had no care for the military, and so it wasn't odd to think that they didn't take much supplies with them because they thought maybe this would be over quickly. And upon landing in Cadiz, the soldiers pilfered wine from the local vats in order to augment their rations. Afterward, they became so drunk that they threatened mutiny against their officers. The leader of the expedition, Sir Edward Cecil, ordered them all back to the ships but left behind 2,000 drunken men, whom the Spanish later executed Again, that's sad, but things happen in war. Of those who made it back to the ships, only half made it home because vicious weather and poor living conditions on the ships. Now, granted, Spain is not that far from England, but still, if you get bad weather over the channel, it could be deadly. And apparently a bunch of those soldiers died on the way back home. In 2002, 24 British Marines on a training exercise stormed a beach that they thought mistakenly was in Gibraltar. As it turned out, they came ashore on a beach resort in La Linea, Spain, instead. The Marines only realized their mistake after the locals and 2 policemen informed them they were in the wrong place. Oops. Our faux pas. The British later attributed the incident to bad weather. As I said, it happens over the channel, I guess, and out the Atlantic nearby, and apologized for their error, a gesture which Spanish officials graciously accepted. They knew there was no meanness in their effort to practice their craft. In a parting shot, the locals wryly pointed out that Gibraltar shouldn't be hard to miss since it has a 1,400-foot rock as its landmark. To be fair to the British, they weren't the only ones who mistakenly invaded a country. The famously defense-minded country of Switzerland also accidentally invaded its tiny neighbor Liechtenstein. Not just once, but 3 times. They even had to compensate Liechtenstein once when Swiss soldiers caused a forest fire. Again, oops. The North Atlantic doesn't hold all of the errors by the militaries. The European theater of World War II was drawing to a close, and crew members of the Bahia, a Brazilian cruiser stationed northeast of Brazil to protect Allied convoys, practiced a live-fire anti-aircraft drill using a kite towed behind their ship as a target. During the course of the exercise, the gunner accidentally hit a row of depth charges on the ship's stern, the consequence of not placing guardrails to prevent the guns from firing so close to the ship. Subsequently, the depth charges exploded and sank that ship in just a few minutes, forcing the crew members to bail out on lifeboats and endure almost a week out at sea. Of the more than 350 men aboard, only a few dozen survived, with 4 U.S. Navy personnel among the dead. That's got to be embarrassing. We need to report a ship sunk. Who did it? What enemy? It was ourselves, sir. During the American Civil War, they found out that it was suicidal to just charge a well-entrenched enemy on a higher ground, but someone must have forgotten to tell Philip Sheridan in 1863. The Union general and his men had just secured the first line of Confederate trenches during the Battle of Missionary Ridge, when he suddenly whipped out a flask and toasted the defenders high above the ridge. The Confederates reciprocated his toast by shooting a few cannon rounds at him, a move that turned out to be a huge mistake. After lambasting the Confederates for their lack of good manners, Sheridan charged toward their positions up the slope. To the relief of everyone, including Sheridan's superior, General Grant, the Union troops succeeded in overrunning the ridge and eventually winning the entire battle. As for Sheridan, he later celebrated his victory in true whimsical fashion by riding a still-hot Confederate cannon. We remember Hannibal as one of history's most successful tacticians, who proved to be more than a match for the Romans several times in his career. Hannibal's military genius could be attributed to his unconventional strategies, such as crossing the Alps with his army in 218 BC. However, according to the Roman historian Polybius and Livy, Hannibal made a critical mistake during his dangerous trek over the snow-capped mountains. At one point, Hannibal's army, which included several war elephants, came to an abrupt halt when they refused to walk across a certain path. Angry at this holdup, the Carthaginian general, who had been marching at the rear, came up to the front and slammed his cane into the snow-covered path to show them it was solid and safe to cross. Unfortunately, that act triggered a huge avalanche that ended up killing more than half of his 50,000 men and several of his elephants. And it took 4 days for the survivors to escape the frozen carnage and finally descend below the Alps. That's definitely one of the big oops. There are times when it's expedient for the press to know military operations. There are times when it's expedient for them to keep their mouth shut. This isn't one of those times. During the fairly recent Falklands War, the Battle of Goose Green would be remembered primarily for two things: as the first and most bloody land battle between the UK and Argentina, and as the incident where the BBC opened its mouth too soon. Secretly landing near the settlement, British soldiers had prepared for a surprise night attack on the Argentine forces when the BBC announced their plans to the world, the Argentines included. This angered the British commanding officer on the ground so much that one of them, Lieutenant Colonel Jones, vowed to sue the BBC and the Ministry of Defense for treason. However, he pushed through with the operation in the hope that the Argentines would believe it was all a ruse to catch them off guard. Jones' hope proved well placed. The leader of the Argentine forces, Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi, believed the British wouldn't be so stupid as to reveal their plans over public radio. So he did nothing to augment his forces. The numerically inferior British ended up taking 1,400 Argentines as prisoners during the battle. Back in the time of Vietnam, there was an incident occurred where a U.S. ship called the USS Pueblo was captured by North Koreans. Apparently they went up the wrong river or something. And these guys, being of the, I would assume, after World War II generations, weren't going to let the North Koreans get them down in any easy way. It was known that the many men of the USS Pueblo would flash the Hawaiian good luck sign, or I think it's called the hang loose sign also. And they did it to show the world that even though they were prisoners, they were not hopeless. Their captain, Lloyd Booker, also did his best to ridicule his tormentors. Although initially resistant to write a confession of wrongdoing, something that apparently many communist captors request of their prisoners, even after enduring several beatings and mock executions, Booker finally relented when the North Koreans threatened to kill his men before his very eyes. At this point, the captors thought they had broken Booker, but they were dead wrong. Taking advantage of the North Koreans' cluelessness in English, Bucher wrote a confession letter in September of 1968, and it was filled with utter nonsense and dripping with sarcasm. The classic lines he wrote included, "We peon," translate that to peon, the Korean People's Army Navy. And we had traversed operation areas Mars, Venus, and Pluto, so named because, like the planets, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is really far out. The North Koreans later released the men on December 23rd of 1968 without ever realizing that Bucher had insulted them on so many levels. This is a story that I've told before, and I told it as a comedic story. Perhaps no other ship in the U.S. Navy can surpass the tragicomic history of the William D. Porter and its crew. Its unenviable resume included wrecking a sister ship with its anchor, friendly firing another one, and accidentally shooting a live round into the base commander's front yard. However, all these incidents paled in comparison to the time the William D. Porter almost assassinated the President of the United States. In 1943, the ship, along with 3 other destroyers, had been assigned to guard the USS Iowa, which carried FDR and his Secretary of State Cordell Hull en route to the Tehran and Cairo conference. During the trip, the William D. Porter caused a major scare when one of its depth charges accidentally fell to the water and exploded, causing the rest of the convoy to think U-boats had found them. After that incident, the crew, in a training exercise, inadvertently launched an armed torpedo right at the USS Iowa. The big ship managed to dodge it just in the nick of time, though. Although the William D. Porter finally did serve with distinction during the Philippine and Okinawa campaigns, the ship met a demise as bizarre as its mishaps. On June 10th of 1945, a kamikaze plane it shot down dove underwater and exploded. But it exploded right by the ship, and it sank the vessel. And miraculously, all the crew members survived. There were 2 other stories I wanted to include, and they both involve planes that shot themselves down. I believe it was in the 60s when an American jet was flying, and it was in a training exercise, and it had to fire its guns during this training exercise. So the plane was in its route, and the pilot pulled the trigger, and the guns went off correctly. And a few seconds later, the windshield of the plane was busted out, and the pilot thought he had had a bird strike. So he ejected, and the plane went down. Well, on investigation, it was found out that the plane was traveling faster than its bullets and had caught up to them, and the bullets crashed the windshield and brought the plane down. Now, that being odd enough, the other one is a Navy F-14 Tomcat, again, on a training mission, and it was going to fire a rocket. Well, it assumed its course and fired the rocket, and then suddenly got hit. And they realized, after all was said and done, that what happened was the plane caught up to its rocket, and the rocket blew up, and the shrapnel from the rocket damaged the plane enough to bring it down. Strange things happen in wartime. Sometimes they're funny strange, sometimes they're weird strange. Sometimes you wouldn't believe this if I told you strange. So that's our story for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it humorous. Maybe even some educational information there. Thanks for being with me on this ride. Hope you'll be back again for more Terry's Mysterious Moments. Have a good week, y'all. Bye.